Hello, welcome back to another video presented by Acuity PPM, where today we're covering portfolio communication. But before we get started, be sure to subscribe to our channel. We put out great content that you don't want to miss that will help you better manage your portfolio and your PMO. So with that, let's get started. And I'd like to start with this quote from Patrick Lencioni, one of my absolute favorites. That if you could get all the people in an organization rowing in the same direction, you could dominate any industry, any market, against any competition at any time. I love this quote because it's an inspiration for why portfolio management is so important, and specifically why portfolio communication is so important. Portfolio management's about maximizing our business value delivery. We prioritize work to get people focused, but it's the communication that's so essential and that so many organizations miss. We like to pay attention to prioritization and capacity planning, but not much attention is given to portfolio communication. But it's essential that you take care of portfolio communication because it's the real heartbeat of the portfolio management process. If you give it an afterthought and you disregard portfolio communication, you're missing out on a huge opportunity to align the organization. That's how important the portfolio communication is. And actually, experts talk about communication all the time, whether it's project communication, leadership communication. Even Lencioni himself talks about leaders being chief communication officers and that they need to over-communicate a message in order for it to have impact. Since we're talking about strategic execution, leadership and the PMO and the portfolio team must pay attention to effective portfolio communication in order to successfully execute strategy and align everyone to get everyone rowing in the same direction to accomplish your goals. Then you can dominate. That's what inspires me about portfolio management, is the opportunity to dominate your industry or your market by getting everybody focused on what's most important. And so in this video, we're going to cover the 5 components of portfolio communication, starting with value, portfolio value and project value, and then risk, portfolio risk, and then performance, the decisions or the governance behind the portfolio, and then finally the process. So let's start with portfolio communication. And the first question we want to answer is, what are we doing? The projects in the portfolio have value, and people many times ask, what is it that the organization is working on? I've come across that many times in my career, and there needs to be a way of communicating what's going on, because people that are not close to the project work, or it's a project team that they have a certain focus but they don't know everything that's going on, you want to get them on board and understand what's happening in the portfolio so people have a broad view of what value the organization is delivering and how are we executing against our strategy. So that's the first question that this helps answer. But when it comes to the project and portfolio value, we also want to communicate the project value that's being delivered. That's oftentimes through the business case. Why are we doing a certain project? What is the benefit of doing that project? When we can communicate that and articulate that, people understand why there's a composition of the portfolio. Why are we selecting certain projects? Or maybe why are we not selecting other projects? The most important item on this list is communicating project priorities. And I can't emphasize enough the need to communicate the priorities in the portfolio, because the priorities are aligned to value. We want to accomplish the most valuable work soonest, and we want to make sure that those high priority projects or those most valuable projects can get done on time, within scope, within budget, and deliver the value that they were intended. In order to do that, we need to communicate priorities. This is how we align people and get people rowing in the same direction. And we've talked about prioritization in other videos. There's value in doing that, but if you fail to communicate the priorities across the organization, you will not get the benefit of prioritizing the projects to begin with. You'll nullify the value of prioritization. You may have the leadership team on board and aligned on what's most important, but if you don't communicate those priorities to the people doing the work, they will work to their own priorities. That's a fact. So communicating the priorities is essential to get everyone working and on the most important work, aligned to what's most important and rowing in the same direction. Can't say enough about the need to communicate. Most organizations don't. Even if they do have an effective scoring model and the leadership team is aligned on the priorities, and that's important in and of itself. I don't want to take anything away from that. But if the people doing the work are not clear on the priorities, they will work to their own priorities. That's why the communication of project and portfolio value is so important. Okay. So then finally, we communicate project delivery and the benefits being realized from that project, oftentimes post-implementation. And then we can summarize all of this with the value in our portfolio. We can do that through dashboards and reports. Okay, so this is communicating portfolio value. The second element is communicating portfolio risk. And it was during a business conference where I was giving a presentation on portfolio risk management that this came to the forefront. There was a question about how to implement portfolio risk management. And what came out was the need for communication. There needs to be communication upward to senior and executive leadership about what the portfolio risks are, what the potential impact could be, the triggers for realizing that risk. That's part of the portfolio risk management process, is good communication. And to get leadership on board, they need to know what the risks are to begin with. So that was the impetus for this video, based on that conference and that discussion on portfolio risk management. And so we want to be sure to communicate specific portfolio risks. And many times that could be at senior leadership. That may not be to the whole organization, especially if there's sensitivity. So it's not to say that all portfolio communication needs to go to the entire organization. The PMO or the portfolio team needs to create a portfolio communication plan to identify key stakeholders. Who needs the communication, what is being communicated. So in this case, a lot of the portfolio risk communication is going to the governance team, to senior leadership, to executive leadership, because it impacts strategic execution, it impacts areas of the business. That's why portfolio risk management is so important, and the communication of the portfolio risks are so important. Certainly when we're doing annual planning or other project selection, we want to understand the risk tolerance. That might come from the board of directors, might come from executive leadership. That needs to be communicated to the portfolio governance team. We also need to make sure there's a channel and an avenue for communicating project risks, because some project risks are so significant that they could have an impact to other elements or other projects in the portfolio. This also corresponds with project dependencies, which is an aspect of portfolio risk. We need to understand the relationships between projects, and we need to communicate that so everyone's aware that if something happens to one project, it could have a ripple effect to others. That's project dependencies. But it falls within communicating portfolio risk, because we want to understand the impact from one project to another. And then finally, in this section, we want to make sure that we can communicate the changes that are occurring, the timing of those changes, and especially, can we absorb those changes? because if you have too many projects concluding at the same time, your organization may not be able to absorb or handle all the changes simultaneously. This is one of the key questions that we've presented in other videos. Can we absorb the change? So this is communicating portfolio risk. The third is around portfolio performance, and frankly, this is the majority of the communication that goes on today, that we're communicating the performance of the specific projects within the portfolio, usually through status reports. We're making the status reports available, or we're putting out the overarching project status, which is necessary, but it's not comprehensive. We want to ensure that the performance of all the projects is communicated out in a timely and effective way to the stakeholders, but also the portfolio performance. We want to demonstrate that we're delivering on our promises. That's why communicating portfolio performance is also important. That's part of the accountability of stating how are we delivering against our stated goals, objectives, strategies, etc. It's one thing to communicate individual project performance. It's another thing to communicate what's the overarching portfolio performance. And so we've got a couple of images here. One is a screenshot from Acuity PPM where we've got the portfolio health mini dashboard, and we've also got the roadmaps. These are ways of communicating portfolio performance. We can communicate when projects are completing. We can communicate major milestones. What's one of the great things about the road mapping feature in Acuity PPM is that you can communicate the performance of major milestones. That's both performance-based and helps communicate how projects are tracking. And then with that, we can see when projects are completing, which then goes back to the earlier conversation about absorbing the change. So these are elements of communicating portfolio performance. Be sure don't limit it simply to status reports. Aggregate it at the portfolio level and then communicate it out. Let people know how the portfolio is doing, because one of the life cycle phases is on protecting portfolio value. When we know how projects are performing, then we can take actions based on actual performance. And then we can demonstrate that to the rest of the organization to get their support and buy-in for the portfolio process to begin with. The fourth component of portfolio communication is around governance and decision making. Some organizations do a reasonable job of cascading decisions across the organization to some stakeholders, but we want to be sure that the decisions are shared as broadly as possible without potentially violating any sensitive information, but communicating. Is there a new project that's been approved? Has there been a project put on hold or canceled? Those are major decisions, and only communicating it with the specific project team, that's an oversight. Other people may be impacted by those decisions. So as much as possible, communicate, cascade those decisions out to the organization. And there's different ways of doing that, but that's part of building a strong portfolio communication plan. If there's budget changes or new budget requests or scope changes or major schedule changes that a governance team's approved, be sure to make that known, because those individual project changes could impact other projects in the portfolio. And then we also have our regularly recurring portfolio review meetings or project status meetings or governance meetings. Some of that information can be shared. Not everything needs to be shared, again, because of sensitivity, but what can be shared probably should be shared for transparency to get everybody, again, aligned and confident in the portfolio process. And then here, I've got this diagram I really like that ties in with leadership communication of how they use project and portfolio data. This is a governance responsibility, and I included here because of the communication piece for how senior leaders are using important project and portfolio data, such as resource forecasts and capacity planning. There's a lot of work that goes into collecting that data. And when senior leaders take the extra step to communicate that they're using that data and then demonstrating how they're using that data to make better decisions, it will solidify those processes. Data quality will improve, and ultimately you'll get better decision making. So what do I mean by that? With capacity planning as an example, there's a lot of work that goes on. And if people feel like the data that they're spending time collecting is going into a black box and is never being used, they're going to be less likely over time to comply with the request to keep feeding that data into a central PPM system or reporting back to the PMO. They'll be more reluctant because they don't see how it's being used. People don't want to waste time on things that don't add value. But when you can communicate, when leadership communicates that they're using that data and demonstrating how they're using that data to make better decisions, people will respond positively and cooperate in a timely way to provide that information. So it's a virtuous cycle around using the data and leadership communicating that they're using the data and how they're using the data. And then finally, the final component, the fifth component of portfolio communication is around process. Don't neglect communicating your process. Educate people. Let them know how to create a new proposal, how the stage gate process works, how your prioritization process works, how resource capacity planning works. Let them know. By doing so, again, you're going to get the support and the buy-in and the confidence that there's a fair process in place, so that they don't believe that projects are approved, for example, by those who yell the loudest or are simply pet projects, but they understand that there's an art and a science behind the project selection, taking into account multiple inputs. That's part of the benefit of communicating portfolio process. So don't overlook it. It may be annual communication, quarterly communication, maybe some video trainings, maybe brown bag sessions. However you do it, be sure to communicate portfolio process. And then finally, we've got a different approach to looking at portfolio communication. We've seen the portfolio lifecycle in other videos. Here we're looking at the 4 stages of the portfolio lifecycle on defining the portfolio, which includes project selection, optimizing portfolio value, protecting portfolio value, and delivering portfolio value. And so those 5 components are laid out here to show that all 5 of those aspects of portfolio communication are included across the board in the portfolio lifecycle. So it's another view on the 5 dimensions of portfolio communication seen through the lens of the portfolio lifecycle. So with that, if you'd like more information, don't hesitate to contact us. We can help you build an effective PMO playbook. Portfolio communication is one element of that. If you like the video, give us a thumbs up, leave a comment below, or if you have a question, put it in the comment section below. I promise to answer. Thank you and have a great day.